Cast. This is your weekly podcast of hardware and home improvement retail news. Brought to you by the Hardware News Network, publisher of HI News. Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of the Hardware News Network's podcast, our HNN Cast.
I'm your host, Betty Tando, Editor-in-Chief of HNN.
And I am your host, Scott Lewis, Editor-at-Large of HNN.
First up is news about Bunnings building new stores in regional and urban areas. We look at what this means for independent hardware retailers.
Next up is the recent release of the Metcash Annual Report. The owner of Australia's independent hardware group, which includes Mitre 10 and HTH, reveals more about future plans for the home improvement retailer.
We have an interview with Jason Ellis, National Marketing Manager for OPE company Ego. Jason offers us some insights on how consumers can be converted to cordless outdoor tools. He also tells us about the company's move into the trade and commercial areas.
We also look at the main features in our most recent issue of HI News, including the disruptive strategies of major global retailers, the Home Depot, Kingfisher, and Bunnings.
We take a deep dive into the results announced by Bunnings for its 2017-2018 financial year.
And finally, we look at the half-year report presented by Tektronix Industries, maker of Milwaukee and Ryobi cordless tools.
All that and more on episode 1 of HNN Cast.
Start by covering some of the week's latest news, and I think, Betty, you've got a few things about Bunnings to talk about.
Bunnings is to open a store in Robina, Queensland. It's set to open before Christmas. It will be the 7th store on the Gold Coast. It will be 12,500 square metres and have 320 car parking spaces. And I think the construction has already started, and it began in September. Bunnings is also continuing its fight in Coolum, Queensland. It has lodged a Supreme Court appeal against a District Court decision not to allow it to build a store as well as a service station and restaurant in Coolum. That development application was Bunnings' third unsuccessful attempt to expand into Coolum. And lastly, Bunnings is expanding its distribution facility in the Port of Brisbane. This means it will add an extra 10,000 square metres to its facility. That means it's adding to its existing 30,450 square metre facility, and it will be part of a new lease deal that will last for 10 years plus options.
Okay, so we're seeing a lot of interesting patterns come out of Bunnings at the moment. I think that we could call this sort of a second wave of expansion that they're doing now. And the first wave was in response to Masters, starting 4 or 5 years ago. And I think that this wave, they're doing two things. I think that they're definitely looking at regions where there's more potential and there are very few stores, and that would be places like the Gold Coast. The other pattern we're seeing is really urban infill stores, where they're trying to get into very much more urban locations where Bunnings has previously not been, and in those urban locations they're doing a different kind of store.
That's true. I think that the smaller store, it's not all smooth sailing for them in those inner suburban areas.
Yeah, I think one of the major things that they're confronting in those, if you look into the planning documents that they're putting into local councils, there's a lot of concern about traffic, and we're seeing some very, let's call it, creative assessment of traffic by Bunnings in those cases. Roselle is probably the one that's most interesting in that way.
Roselle in Sydney.
Yeah, the inner suburb there. Yeah, and I think, Betty, you do tend in these arguments that we have sometimes at HNN to very strongly and staunchly take the point of view of the smaller independent retailers. And I tend to think that we need to think about them. We also need to think, though, about consumers and how they benefit.
I understand that, but in this instance, in this particular circumstance, an economist found that the area is already well serviced by Bunnings stores as well as smaller stores. So I don't know how that's... obviously, for the consumer, they'll have a lot more choice, but there's also a thing about over-servicing too.
Yeah, I guess the other point to that, though, is that do we really want to go back to the 60s and 70s in Australia when there was inadequate competition in a lot of retail sectors and we had extremely high margins? Consumers suffered from that. And I'm not saying I don't think it should go one way or another, but how do you find that point of balance? How do you approach that point of balance between where consumers are getting lower prices and access to wider ranges of goods, and where there's also the infrastructure of smaller businesses, which are also vital to the economy?
Well, I think there definitely needs to be a balance, but in this case, if it shows that the area is already well serviced, why can't Bunnings find somewhere else to build?
Yeah, that's one perspective, but you can also say that if Bunnings wants to open a store there and is going to invest a lot of money in a very large store, plus a restaurant, plus a service station, that they must really see this as a very good source of revenue and earnings. I don't think the Bunnings are doing it with the expectation of making a loss.
Well, I wish that in terms of the economic contribution Bunnings will make to the area can flow on to other independent stores, but that doesn't really happen.
No, I agree with you, and it's just a very, very difficult situation, I think, to judge fairly.
I don't know why for supermarkets it can flow on to smaller grocers that are open around them, or bread stores, or bakeries and things like that. The smaller stores that offer the same or similar produce to a supermarket can survive near a large supermarket chain. In fact, sometimes they do really well. So why doesn't it work with hardware retail?
That's a really, really great point. And it gets us back to the single biggest point of puzzlement I have when looking at smaller sort of independent hardware stores, and that's why there's such an incredible lack of specialization. Because if you're going up against a large retailer like Bunnings, usually the response of smaller retailers is to specialize in some particular area. And the only kind of specialization that we've really seen across the board is into trade, which is a very, very broad sort of area.
Broad area, lower margin too.
Yeah, definitely. But supposing that you said, well, look, I'm in Queensland. There's a lot of houses around here. One of the things houses do a lot is they add on decks. I will become a specialist in decks and decking materials and decking constructors and all the rest of it. But you never see that happen. Independent hardware stores always are very, very broadly general.
Yeah, I don't know. It could be part of based on some of the relationships with buyers or buying approach. I'm not sure. But I've always been curious about why smaller independent grocers and, like I mentioned, bakeries do well around a Coles or a Woolies, but independent hardware retailers fail and close around a Bunnings. But there are some exceptions that we know of. Some hardware retailers continue to do well even after a new Bunnings store is built close to them.
Yeah, it's a very curious thing too, because if you think about specialization, the only area where we've seen very broad specialization with some success has actually been in power tools. And that is just bizarre to me because, of course, if you go to most independent hardware stores, they'll tell you that they have way cut down on the number of power tools that they stock over the last 20 years or so because of competition from Bunnings. It's a very puzzling situation.
I don't think we're going to solve it today.
Okay. That's my cue to move on to the next topic. I guess the other interesting bit of news that came out in the past week or so was that Metcash, which of course is the owner of the independent hardware group IHG, which consists of Mitre 10 and the Home Timber and Hardware stores as well. They came out with the annual report, and they had a couple of interesting things that they said there. One of the most interesting ones to me was the degree to which they're starting to push their trade-only stores. And one of the changes that we saw there is that they're referring to them not just as trade-only stores, but trade-only sapphire stores. So it sounds as though they've got some particular program in place that's dedicated to trade and is trying to bring the kind of sapphire store improvement program that they have, which in other stores is a little bit more oriented towards the DIY market, I would argue, but they're trying to bring that over into trade as well. And they made a prediction that they would have over 200 Sapphire stores built out by 2022.
Is that Sapphire Trade or Sapphire normal?
It could be a combination of both, but they're actually for 2019 they're forecasting only 8 trade
yep.
Sapphire stores. So I would say if it is part of that, it would probably make up about 30 at most, and I think that would be pushing it. So, but 200 stores over the next 3 years. So you're talking about 60, 70 stores a year, and their progress to date has been quite slow. So it's quite
stretch target.
Yeah, I think so. The other thing, stretch target. The other thing, of course, that's interesting is that Sapphire only applies to the Mitre 10 brand. It doesn't apply to the HTH brand. And we're going into a period now where, according to what the CEO of IHG, Mark Laidlaw, said at last year's IHG Expo held in Adelaide, was that basically that.
This year.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, it was held this year. Sorry, I'm always a bit in the future. Held in 2018 in Adelaide. One of the things that he commented on at that time, sort of a change of strategy, was that they would definitely be still moving HTH stores into being part of Mitre 10, but it was going to be delayed for 2 years and it was going to kind of go very slowly. I think one of the reasons why they might be pushing for 200 plus Sapphire stores is that when you become a Sapphire store, you also become a Mitre 10 store. So they might be looking at the most promising HTH stores and kind of as something to numb the pain of going from HTH to Mitre 10, they also convert them into Sapphire stores. And the other reason why Sapphire is so important to Mitre 10 is that when you do convert into Sapphire, the store then makes additional commitments in terms of what they call core ranging. So anyhow, there wasn't much more than that coming out of the annual report. It was actually, in terms of Metcash in general, it was a very, very tame annual report. But you do have the sense of the food business part of it getting into a little bit more trouble with the loss of some of their key retailers. And of course, if the food business gets into trouble, there'll be a little bit more pressure on IHG as well. There'll be less capital available, and IHG will be expected to really step up to the plate and deliver the earnings before interest and taxation, EBIT earnings, in the coming year as well.
Which they've been doing well on in the last few years.
Yeah, they have. And I think one of the really surprising things was that they really did, Laidlaw and his team really did a very good job of integrating HTH. But there's always been that question mark hanging over the activities of IHG, of whether they're going to really have the kind of capital they should have to reinvest into the business to really drive it forward. And I think we're still waiting to see how that turns out in the future as well. We took some time recently to catch up with Jason Ellis, who is National Marketing Manager for Ego Power Plus, which makes and markets the Ego brand of outdoor power equipment. Ego is particularly well known for its line of cordless lawnmowers. Just to give some context, the Australian consumer group Choice conducted a test of high-end cordless lawnmowers in September 2018, and Ego ended up with 2 of its mowers in the top 5. Those mowers had the best and second best run times of all the mowers Choice recommends at 65 and 45 minutes. One of the Ego mowers was also the least expensive of all those tested. We began our conversation with Jason by talking about some of the cheaper consumer mowers on the market and where Ego sits in the market as compared to them. I've actually used about maybe half a dozen different cordless mowers. One of them was an Ego. How do you see the price point and Ego's appeal to the DIYer and others?
We are priced above them, but also our performance and KPIs on what we aim up are above those sort of brands. They're much more a DIY brand. Ours is really the weekend warrior, the aspirational DIY and the commercial users. We are moving into commercial. Each year we have a commercial user program through April, May, where we go out, seed the market, talk to commercial users, the different franchises out there. We do not sell direct. We do that in conjunction with retailers that we are in partnership with to, 1, promote the product, and 2, to direct them to our dealers. But we are definitely going more into commercials. We've seen the need for commercial users because of OH&S issues, noise, sound, vibration, that cordless is able to meet all these requirements that petrol cannot. The future of Ego is to look at every facet of outdoor power equipment for the commercial user. We will continually launch and promote product for the home user, the DIY. But given the legislations that are changing, we've recently had the demise of two-stroke. We know that in Europe, councils are banning all use of petrol, and we're also hearing that through Canada that it's not long before that will start to filter down into Australia and New Zealand. So we understand that there is going to be a demand on the need and requirements for cordless products, regardless of brand, but we know that there's certain parameters through that runtime, charge time and power that is required by users to emulate petrol product, and therefore Ego is challenging our development team, our manufacturing team, to create product that meet those requirements.
We see a lot of advertising that still seems aimed at getting people off petrol and into electric, but I'm just wondering whether the market isn't really developing from that to what's the best electric lawnmower, cordless lawnmower for your purposes. So how do you see that from Ego's perspective?
So Ego, we do target petrol, and fundamentally the reason for that is historically a lot of cordless products just haven't met the demands of users from a power, performance, runtime and charge time aspect. That's been really the hurdle for people crossing over to cordless. It's okay for the standard DIY using it for 10 minutes, but if someone's got a bigger block or if someone is a commercial user, up till now, cordless really hasn't provided them with what they need.
That's really a matter of two things then. It's power and runtime.
And charge time.
And how has Ego sort of solved those problems?
So I guess on the first one, the charge time is having a rapid charger. So really it's just being able to charge it in a time that is convenient, but also if a user has two batteries, in a lot of cases, if we've got a battery that runs for 50 minutes and we've got a rapid charger that charges it in, say, 60 minutes, you've got infinite runtime. By the time they finish using one battery, the other battery will be charged. So that's one factor. On the runtime, it is working out the area that people need to cut and how long that takes, and then being able to have a machine with the right amp hour battery that will cover that off for 80% of the cases. For instance, when we did research on lawn sizes, 80% are below 800 square metres, which means therefore 80% of the population could be covered by our 7.5 amp battery. And
the actual power of the mower, how does that compare?
So it's really hard to directly correlate between, say, a CC motor with the torque and cordless, but it's the ability of the product to cut and perform and get the outcome that they would normally get from a petrol unit. And that's what we're getting. People are saying, it's cutting through branches, it's cutting through logs with the chainsaw, or it's cutting my grass as good, if not better, than a petrol unit. One thing we try and do is people who have been in trade working with power tools understand one battery fitting all tools, but a lot of people in gardening who have never touched cordless actually don't understand or aren't aware that one battery can power all tools because they might never have owned a drill or a circ saw or anything from a cordless point of view. So this is a new foray. So one of the things we constantly advertise is that our ARC lithium 56-volt battery powers all Ego tools. We have every single Ego product that is available globally is sold throughout Australia and New Zealand. If you branched it out into all the kits, skins, attachments, battery, chargers and accessories, we have 69 SKUs in the range.
Okay, that's a really interesting point because I actually know people who are like that, who have like 5 different battery platforms. And it never occurred to me that it's because they don't have that conceptual grasp of the single battery platform. I just thought they were making mistakes,
No, so, and it's something that I'm from a power tool background. So, I've always developed and launched from NiCad nickel metal hydride to lithium. So it was always known to me how it works, where coming into outdoor power equipment, it was very obvious that, people weren't understanding the benefits of getting a cordless platform that then crosses many, many product categories. Being able to utilise that one battery across many usages helps, one, manage costs, but two, get the most out of your product and the price you're paying for it.
What would be the sort of path that a retailer would go down to start to stock Ego?
Yeah, so we have a sales representative in every state, and they are constantly visiting hardware stores, specialists, retailers all around Australia. But also we have our support email address, our contact us through our website, our social media pages. So we have a number of outlets where dealers can contact us. And once they do contact us, we then get our representative to talk to them and meet with them to show them the range and the steps in becoming an Ego dealer.
If you're interested in hearing more about Ego outdoor power equipment, the company can be contacted on 1300 000 EGO. That is 1300 000 346. HNN would like to thank Jason and Ego for their support. Okay, so we should move along to some of the major articles that we had in the past issue of HI News number 4-07. And of course, the major feature was one of our longest features ever about disruption in the home improvement industry.
So can you give us a brief explanation of business disruption and what it means in terms of big box home improvement retailers?
Yeah, I guess disruption is a word that's been kind of misused and abused over recent years. There's one kind of basic disruption, which was really based on theories from a Harvard professor by the name of Clayton Christensen. And that kind of disruption is about companies actually developing products which are not high-end, high-range, but actually are low-range, but which satisfy the needs of the majority of customers with fewer features and a lower price. And that was one kind of disruption. But we've really come to generalize the term, I think, to almost any situation where the market has kind of split into two or more segments and where it's necessary to switch from concentrating on one segment to concentrating on a different segment of the market.
Okay, because to me, looking at the story, disruption seems to be in part a transformative process, and each of the retailers that you profile seem to be doing it to themselves.
Yeah, I guess it's transformative, but I think it's a particular type of transformation because it often means taking some process that you've had in past that's been quite successful for you and making a really abrupt shift to it. And if I had to give you an example of that, the best example would be at the Home Depot when Frank Blake took over running it as CEO. And Blake had been, prior to that, he'd come to the Home Depot from General Electric, GE, where he'd been in charge of making acquisitions for GE, which is how GE grows, through acquisitions. And when he was hired at Home Depot, it was for doing exactly the same thing. So he went out and he worked there, I think, for 2 or more years, making all these acquisitions and everything. And the earnings at Home Depot took a huge steep dive in 2006. And so they came over to Frank and they said, would you please take over running the Home Depot as CEO? And he initially refused, but he said, I'll think about it. And a day later, they got together again and he agreed to do it. And the very first thing that Mr. Blake did was he undid all of the work that he'd been doing previously. So he actually sold off everything that they told him to acquire previously. And that's a good example of a kind of disruptive action. Yeah,
I liked the story of him being the reluctant CEO, which helped us to write the comment piece in this edition. And obviously Frank Blake is the previous CEO to the current CEO, Craig Manier. But I really liked his story of how he didn't really want to take the job in the first place, and but he obviously took on the reins, and as you said, undid a lot of the things that he did, which is I think very brave as an incoming CEO.
Yeah, I think the two other things that he did that were that kind of disruptive behavior was that the previous CEO, who we will not name for whatever reason, had a real philosophy of devaluing the floor staff who worked at the Home Depot. And there were rumors, which we can't substantiate, that they did a lot of things so that when floor staff became more senior and would have to be paid more money, that they kind of shuffled them out the door and got in more junior people to take their place because they would not cost as much.
Like McDonald's?
No comment. And the McDonald's who? The result of that, of course, was very poor customer service. And one of the first things that Mr. Blake did was to stop that practice, to begin to reward people working as a sales associate on the floor for their experience and their knowledge, really ramp up staff retention. And at the same time, he also, of course, one of his most important moves was he halted growth in terms of opening new stores. That was the very first decision he made, another really disruptive decision.
Yeah, I really like, I really find it fascinating how they stopped building bricks and mortar stores several years ago and now seem to be quite focused on the delivery aspects of e-commerce.
Yeah, well, it really was a three-part process, and the second part of that was really paying a lot of attention to logistics and the supply chain at both ends. So they started to enter into more deals with suppliers and to cultivate particular suppliers and become very involved in products and all the rest of it. And they also really ramped up the logistics that delivered goods store to store and also store to customer as well. And those were the first two parts of what I see as being this very particular triangle of things that Mr. Blake did. And the third one, which actually developed later on, it really started around about 2010, and then picked up an enormous head of steam around about 2012, which was what Mr. Blake termed and his team termed interconnected retail, which is what is sort of like omni-channel. In other words, allowing customers to access products both in the physical stores but also through online e-commerce. And what really happened when he did that, and I don't think they'd planned on this, but what happened was when they opened up the interconnected commerce, suddenly all the changes, all the development that they had put through with the logistics really came to the fore, really had a powerful influence on the market. So interconnected retail and selling online was like a force multiplier applied to all the work they'd done on logistics. And that really, really came to the forefront after 2012. And if you read through what they're saying about it, the primary thing that really drove commerce for them at that time was the development of mobile and the broad acceptance of smartphones in their communities of consumers.
And what about Kingfisher? Because to me, what I found interesting about that business is how Veronique Laurie is unifying its supply chain, and its study of customers custom buying behaviours was also really interesting. We've used that infographic to illustrate how its customers buy bathroom products a few times, and I think I really like it because it identified the process in 28 steps and found that 39% of consumers gave up, but in that 39%, obviously they've found opportunities there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. I think probably if we, I'm not going to, of course, her name is really pronounced Veronique Laurie, which I don't think I'll be able to do, so I'm going to call her by her nickname, although I don't know her at all, which is Vero, a lot easier to say. But I think a lot of what Vero brought to the company was a real sense of what you might call pan-Europeanness. And when she went out there and went into the homes of people in the UK, in France, in Poland, in Germany, and all these different countries, to see how customers were actually really using the products, what she expected to find, and I think she did find, was that when it came down to how Europeans used products to build a bathroom or something like that, it was remarkably similar from one country to another. The actual bathrooms themselves would vary in terms of size and style and everything else like that, but a lot of the basics were fundamentally the same. And that was one part of the equation that she was looking at. The other part of the equation was taking all of those supplies across the entire Kingfisher business, which includes, of course, B&Q and Screwfix in the UK, Castorama and Brico Depot in France, and a number of other companies all through Europe, was to take all those supply needs and concentrate them on as few products as possible. So she really reduced the number of stock keeping units, SKUs, that were out there. So you have this remarkable similarity then, a similar point of origin for all these products. And you have at the very end people using them in a remarkably similar fashion. But in between those two is where the real diversity comes in. Because the way you go about buying something in the UK for your home is radically different to how you buy it in France or in Poland. And the kinds of marketing that work to get you to buy that are radically different in France and Poland. So she had this way of understanding the two endpoints of the process could be unified, supply and actual use. But in between that, there was an enormous amount of diversity that had to be looked at.
Yeah, very very macro, and some great findings that she delivered as part of her strategy.
Yeah, and I guess for us, we saw, just as we saw a kind of triangle of power or efficiency emerge at the Home Depot, there was a singular kind of triangle that emerged, I think, at Kingfisher as well. And that was, first of all, the development of the offer and how the supply chain worked with that. It was about then having unified offerings. So in other words, to reduce the number of SKUs. And the third part of the triangle was actually having unique products. And at Kingfisher, what they mean by unique products is actually own branded products as well. And again, just as we saw with the Home Depot, where you had, freezing the stores, improving logistics, and then interconnected retail formed this magical kind of set of relationships. The offer supply chain, unified product lines, and unique product lines formed a similar kind of powerful triangle at Kingfisher.
So why is Bunnings in the same category as Kingfisher, Home Depot and Lowe's?
Well, like a lot of your questions, Betty, that's a very, very tricky and good question because there's a lot of levels to it. We could say that Bunnings is in the business of disruption at the moment because its first attempt at a kind of disruption, which was to open up a business in the UK, Buki as it's called, completely failed. And it's now looking at how it can improve its chances in its home market of Australia. But I think there's more to it than that. I think Bunnings has been really ripe for a kind of disruption for 2 or 3 years, even though it's been very successful. But it's a more subtle and more difficult kind of disruption. I guess one of the difficulties in writing about Bunnings in this context was that we've written so much about Bunnings, the strategy day, and as we'll get to in a little bit here, the actual results, their annual results for 2017, 2018. But in really thinking about it, I kind of really pondered what we could say about Bunnings and disruption and what kind of direction they could go in. And the thing that kept on coming back to my mind was, what is it that Bunnings does? And fundamentally what they do is they look at their business of home improvement and they constantly and consistently ask themselves, how can we make this better? How do we make Bunnings better? How do we make the retail shop experience better? And in thinking about this, I began to think, well, maybe that's the core expertise that Bunnings has, is the ability to ask those questions and to find good answers to them.
But, are you saying other retailers don't do that?
I think that other retailers don't do it as well as Bunnings does, and not as thoroughly and as deeply, because Bunnings has this sense of always going back to the basics. They have a relationship with the supplier that goes along for a year, maybe 2 years, and then they go back to the supplier and say, and what now? How do we make this better? Rather than just cruising along with it as it is. So I think it's almost like they have this zero-sum approach to how they go about strategically looking at product lines and service in stores and things like that. So what would happen if they took that? This was my thinking. If they took that and they applied it to a range of other businesses that are kind of clustered around the core business of home improvement. What about if they said, how do we make kitchens better? Caboodle, which is their captive brand in kitchens, is a great company. They've been doing a great job, but it's almost as though there's another level to what they could be doing. They could be reinventing kitchens or re-examining how kitchens get made. And the same thing with their trade business. We tend to think of trade businesses as being a store. You go into a store, you load a truck, and you take the truck somewhere with goods. But what would happen if you just changed that entirely? What would happen if you just had real warehouses clustered in a circle, say 60 kilometers out from the center of Melbourne, around Melbourne, had 5 or 6 warehouses like that, and the only contact you had with customers was they're calling up or placing orders online and trucks showing up at their work site, exactly at the time that they need those goods. Then you wouldn't need a physical store. There wouldn't be any interaction with that. And it might be a vast improvement over what people are getting today.
Yeah, we haven't really seen that before in hardware retail.
I guess the thought really came to me because of what I saw, some of the great work that was being done at Doncaster Mitre 10 by the Cornwells, father and son, in terms of delivering goods to trades. And it really occurred to me when I was there that do they really need the store to actually do that? Could they not do that just out of a plain warehouse?
Interesting.
So I guess we can move on to the Bunnings results and just take a quick look at those now.
So in terms of the Bunnings results, I've only got really one question. So will Wesfarmers depend on Bunnings more after the Coles divestment?
Yeah, a lot more. The extent to which it's going to be more is going to depend on two things. It's going to depend on the amount that Bunnings manages to grow over the next 2 to 3 years, and it's going to depend on what kinds of acquisitions that Wesfarmers makes. So Wesfarmers is pretty likely to make a number of acquisitions over the next year or two. But if you look at, we have a couple of graphs in HI News that sort of demonstrate what we're looking at.
What page are they on?
Yeah, that's on page 40. It comes at the end of our piece on Bunnings results. And if you look at the graph on that shows, for instance, that currently Coles is responsible for 59% of revenues at Wesfarmers and Bunnings is responsible for 19% of revenues. After the change, without Coles, Bunnings will be responsible for 46% of revenue. Similarly, in terms of EBIT earnings, at the moment, Coles is responsible for 33% of those, and Bunnings is also responsible for 33% of earnings. And after the, as you will know, mathematicians, after Coles exits, Bunnings will be responsible for 50% of the EBIT revenue of EBIT earnings that Wesfarmers produces.
What acquisitions do you think Wesfarmers will make?
Well, I don't know about outside of the home improvement industry, but I think there are some acquisitions they could make inside home improvement. I guess one of those that keeps cropping up as a possibility is the TradeLink plumbing business that's currently owned by Fletcher's Building, because Fletcher's has not done very well with it, although they're making it work a little bit better. And really, plumbing is one of those areas in Australia that could really do with some very strong competition entering into it. There's just a couple of companies in there that have a surprisingly high market share, such as Reese, and one wonders if they really completely deserve that, to be frank.
That's a good point. And what can you say about the general results for Bunnings?
Look, they've been pretty good. There was some noise in the press about how they weren't quite as good as they were for the last year or something. But really, given the state of the Australian economy and a few other things, I think that internal things to Wesfarmers and partly, I think they've done very well. Sales revenue went up 8.95%, which was an additional billion with a B. Dollars in revenue for the year. And EBIT also climbed by 12.74%, which was up around about close to $180 million a year. It came in at $1.5 billion. So generally speaking, it's been pretty robust growth and really what we've come to expect from Bunnings. Although Mr. Schneider, the managing director of Bunnings, has given us a few warning words about maybe seeing slowing growth in the future, I think, which is largely linked to what the economy might be doing. We'll have to see what happens with that.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. So we just want to finish off by saying a few things about TTI and the presentation that was included in the last issue. Can I just ask you, why do you always choose to feature the TTI presentation by Joe Galley and not other power tool companies?
Yeah, a good question. I really think that Joe Galley is just a complete gift to the home improvement industry globally. He's a fantastic CEO. He's done amazing things with Tectonic Industries, and of course that's partly because the company has been really founded and well built by Horst Pudwill over there in Hong Kong. Really, the approach that Galley has brought to the company is one of seeing it as primarily being a technology company and advancing the technology of power tools. There wasn't that long ago, I think there was a results announcement by Stanley Black & Decker, I think 2.5 years ago, and an analyst asked a question, well, do you think that things are going to continue to develop at this pace in power tools? And somebody in Stanley Black & Decker management answered, we don't think so. We don't think there's going to be that much development. And really, Joe Galley has really prodded the entire industry, the entire power tools industry, to continuously develop or face losing market share to them, really. There's that also. Joe Galley is just one of those really lovely, magnetic personalities, and it's just fun listening to it. It sounds bizarre, but he can actually make these annual results announcements and half-yearly announcements really entertaining, and usually because he's lightheartedly attacking some of his critics in a very thorough but rather pleasing manner that really makes it fun to listen to.
I think I've always found it fascinating too how Joe Galley always refers to his company as the Apple of power tools, and he doesn't just say that because his investment in young graduates coming out of MIT and sort of other Ivy League schools is amazing, and like other very good CEOs, he seems to really be investing in the future of the company.
Yeah, and he's really taking a very different route to developing these tools. A lot of people are concentrating their efforts on a very, very narrow range of tools. And his is constantly expanding into all sorts of things. Basically, anything that you're doing today and you have a really clunky manual tool to work with, I think Milwaukee and TTI in general want to develop a tool that you can use that's battery powered and makes the task a lot easier. And that's why, as we mentioned earlier, he's looking to expand the companies way outside of just the construction, housing and construction industry, and into all sorts of things like utility power companies, all kinds of maintenance, all kinds of anything that involves using a power tool. And that's where they're really getting their growth from, I think, is from that genuine market expansion. And I don't really know what the competitors are going to do about them. I see a little bit of more uptick in terms of those less central power tools across a couple of suppliers, but it's not very many of them, really.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of HNN Cast.
Next week, we will talk about the Mitre 10 Sapphire program, as well as interviews with retailers in the Hardware and Building Traders Group.
Tune in for all of that and much more on next week's HNN Cast.
See you next time.